everybody. Come on in, grab your coffee, and join us. I am Danny Russell. I'm the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I very much welcome you all here today. We're in a hybrid world where most of our audience is online, so I very much appreciate those of you who have manifested yourself here in physical form. Thanks for coming, and that's particularly true to the folks that have come up from Washington, D.C., Peter Harrell, Tim Wu, and our own Elena Noor, who's going to moderate this great panel. So, just speaking personally, I began my Foreign Service career in 1985, gasp. And it was the era of, I don't know, the Selectric typewriter. It was the era of teletype, of phone books, of telephones that had those sort of curly wires connecting you to the wall or the desk, to whiteout, sort of unimaginable relics. So I think I'm very qualified to attest to the degree to which the internet has revolutionized, transformed our lives, certainly government, certainly diplomacy. Information collection, communication, analysis, those are all the things that I did for a living, and they all became orders of magnitude easier to do with the advent of the internet. So to somebody of my generation, the internet really is a marvel. I mean, it is pretty extraordinary. It's a decentralized system, but it's operated, it's managed, it's controlled by millions of private, public, non-governmental stakeholders. Miraculously, it somehow works to seamlessly integrate people from all over the world, allow us to learn, to shop, to communicate. And we collaborate now in ways and at a speed that were really unimaginable, even in the sci-fi books that I used to enjoy reading growing up. So I, for one, am truly alarmed by the efforts to curtail the global character of the internet. To wall off internet access, to create separate networks, to withdrawing from international governance bodies and blocking membership in them. So this, to me, is not an arcane or theoretical problem. It's very real, and I think internet freedom unmistakably is something worth fighting for. So the Declaration for the Future of the Internet that was launched by the United States and partners last April, it lays out a very clear rationale. It lays out an affirmative vision for what it is that we're trying to accomplish, what it is we're trying to protect, what it is we're trying to prevent. So I'm really delighted on behalf of the Asia Society to welcome here today two of the White House's chief architects of this vision to talk about the declaration, Peter Harrell and Tim Wu. Peter is Special Assistant to the President for International Economics and Competitiveness and Senior Director at the National Security Council and National Economic Council. I know a little bit about how challenging that job is, having served alongside Peter's predecessors in that position in my own NSC career. So, Peter, since you are going to be kicking us off, let me welcome you and yield the podium to you. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to put this down here. Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be. Sure, of course. I want to make sure people can hear me, so of course. It's great to be here with everyone in person today, and I really want to thank Danny, you, and the Asia Society for hosting us.
As I was telling Danny beforehand, it's a real treat to be up here and to see Danny, who I hadn't seen in a number of years, certainly not since COVID pandemic, and really want to thank you for hosting this event. I'm going to make just a couple of minutes of remarks about the DFI and about the Biden-Harris administration's global internet agenda, but I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief because I know we're all going to have a very robust panel discussion both amongst ourselves and with all of you following my remarks, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for that. Earlier this year, on April 28th, the United States, Japan, along with partners from Asia and around the world, launched the Declaration for the Future of the Internet. And then in May, when President Biden visited Seoul, the Republic of Korea became the 60th country to join the DFI, something that we had rolled out with members from all regions of the world. The Declaration for the Future of the Internet announces our shared democratic principles for conduct and use of digital technologies, and it affirms our vision for the future of the Internet, one that reclaims the promise of the Internet as an enabler of human expression, of innovation, and of economic opportunity. It's a promise that, as Danny suggested, stems from the very design of the Internet, one that is single and interconnected communication system for all of humanity. It comes at an important time as we now rely on the Internet for all aspects of life, from communicating with our families, particularly over the last several years as we've dealt with the pandemic, to buying things we need, to starting businesses and figuring out new ways to innovate. But in recent years, we've increasingly seen digital tools being used to repress freedom of expression and to deny other human rights and fundamental freedoms. We face every day disinformation spreading online, sowing division and conflict. It's no secret that authoritarian actors are engaged in a concerted effort to undermine the global Internet. The Internet that is human and rights-based, open, accessible, and governed by the multi-stakeholder community. We believe in a future for the Internet that is open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, and secure. One that protects human rights and fundamental freedoms. One that advances the free flow of information and inclusive and affordable access so that all people can benefit from the digital economy. That promotes trust in the digital ecosystem, including through the protection of privacy, and that protects the multi-stakeholder model for Internet governance. This model of multi-stakeholder Internet governance has contributed to the Internet's exceptional growth and proven to be incredibly successful at supporting a resilient global Internet. I wanted to come to speak about the DFI at the Asia Society, not just because of the importance that the administration places on global Internet policy, and not just because of the Asia Society's illustrious history facilitating greater understanding between Asia and the West, but because the reality is that we increasingly face competition over the future of what the Internet looks like, and much of that competition is going to play out in Asia. Authoritarian competitors continue to put forward their alternative vision of the Internet, one that is erecting barriers to the flow of information and instead pushes out propaganda and misinformation. One that facilitates censorship and repression and that is managed by states, not the civil society model we believe in. We've also seen an Internet, as I mentioned, that started as a place where new and disruptive companies could be founded by a couple of people in a dorm room or in a garage or in a coffee shop, that's become increasingly dominated by a handful of companies, raising concerns about fair competition and the need to keep the Internet economy competitive, both here in the United States and around the world. Unfortunately, we regularly see examples of this alternative vision in action. In just the last few weeks, we've seen Russia continue to spread lies and misinformation in Europe about its war in Ukraine. But even more, we've seen Russia spread its misinformation globally, where Russia's been claiming that it is U.S. sanctions and not its war against one of the great breadbaskets of the world, Ukraine, that have contributed to global food insecurity. We've seen just this year China take steps to further wall off large swaths of its population from the global Internet, and it has increasingly begun to limit the flow of even non-sensitive data across its borders, while conducting surveillance campaigns against both its own citizens and around the world. We see around the world that the use of untrusted network infrastructure can contribute to and enable mass data collection and surveillance. And we've seen governments around the world use spyware to hack journalists and civil society activists and to support repression against their critics. We have to work with our allies and partners, particularly in Asia, to advance our vision of the internet and to push back against this alternative. We cannot take it for granted that our vision will prevail. We have to fight for it. Indeed, I think in recent years we've seen trends in many ways moving in the wrong direction. And it's time for us to step up our response and to advocate for that global, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet. But frankly, whether our vision prevails will depend on our ability to gather a big tent of allies and partners from all parts of the world, developing countries as well as developed countries, from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, and from Latin America, as well as from North America and from Europe. Following the launch of the DFI, positive global reactions from elected officials around the world, from global partners, from industry, and from civil society alike have applauded the commitment of global partners to our visions. And we're continuing to build out support internationally with a conference that's planned in Europe in November to try to bring additional partners into the fight. These positive reactions reinforce that we're on the right track as we embark on and continue this journey. I want to make a note because I've often gotten this question about what's the message of the DFI to people who are in countries that are advocating for this alternative model. And I want to make clear that for us, the DFI vision is universal. It is something that all people around the world should be able to buy into. Obviously, certain governments are out there pursuing an alternative vision, trying to wall off their own people. And it is precisely with the DFI that we're trying to push back on that alternative model to keep the internet global, open, interoperable, and secure. In endorsing the DFI, the U.S. and Declaration partners have politically committed to work together to promote this vision of the internet and its principles globally. Some say that the time has passed, but we believe that now is the time for others to join us in endorsing this vision and living up to all of our commitment for a better future of the internet. We look forward to working with countries over the months and years to come to build out this vision, both to bring in additional partners and also to make sure that we as governments are actually living up to the commitments that we have made. Our feet held to the fire by civil society and by other actors, and looking to build out a broad coalition for what we believe the future of the internet should be. Thank you again for the chance to speak with all of you today, and I look forward to the discussion on the panel. Over there, yes.
Thank you very much, Peter. Can I invite the other panelists to join me on stage? We'll have a conversation following Peter's remarks. Tim Wu, Nabiha Said, Nick Bramble, and Farzana Badi.
Musical chairs? Wonderful. Thank you.
Nick, you're here.
Sure.
I'd like to extend my own greetings to all of you. My name is Elena Noor. I am the Director of Political Security Affairs and the Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office at the Asian Society Policy Institute. Thank you all for being here. We will get into several rounds, hopefully, of conversation with all these panelists, whom I'll introduce very shortly. And then I'll open it up to your questions and comments. We're also taking interventions online from our audience, tuning in on our social media channels. So you should have on your seat a fuller bio of each of these speakers. But you've all been acquainted with Peter Harrell. Tim Wu is the Special Assistant to the President for Technology and Competition Policy at the National Economic Council. Nick Bramble is Senior Counsel at Google. Farzana Badi is the founder of Digital Medusa. And maybe I'll get Farzana to explain a little more about what Digital Medusa is and does later on. And last but certainly not least, Navia Said is the CEO of the Markup. And you can also explain what your organization does a little later. But we'll get straight into it, a lot to discuss. Peter, I would like to follow up on a point that you raised, but I'd like to direct the question to Tim, and you can chime in later if you'd like. Peter, you had mentioned this distinction between democracies and autocracies, and that's encapsulated in the DFI to a certain extent. And some would say that, well, maybe there isn't this very clear distinction between democracies and autocracies, and that there are democracies, particularly in Asia, that are beginning to craft very diverse approaches, especially in relation to the data governance landscape. Do you think that maybe this binary is a little too simplistic and doesn't quite reflect kind of the unique contexts and political situations in these other democracies in Asia? And how do DFI principles account for these alternative approaches?
Sure. Thanks. And I want to add my thanks to Peters for hosting us here. And it's terrific to see everybody. You know, I think it's a good question, and I think it's something we need to be sensitive to. When we crafted this declaration, it was a result of a great number of conversations, iterative conversations with countries all around the world. You know, I want to stress that this is not a U.S. sort of product, but one in which countries all around the world, particularly Europe, played an enormous role in the thinking and drafting about. And you know, the idea, in fact, was not to to reflect this kind of a broadness in the range of opinions around the world, and not to sort of in the text of the declaration sort of declare countries one way or another, but instead to focus on conduct, to talk about the kind of conduct that we think should be clearly respected by countries of the world to be off limits. You know, there are a number of governments and also some private actors who have clearly sought to undermine, take advantage of the openness of the internet. And we believe that some of these activities, whether it's spreading myths and disinformation online, whether it's market concentration in some private markets, whether it's malicious cyber activity, including ransom attacks, proliferation of internet shutdowns, arbitrary, unlawful surveillance. These are all just activities that we should, as a world and as countries, come together and declare off limits. So it's much less, I think, in our conversations about a desire to just have this sort of binary that you're talking about, and more of a desire to declare certain conduct as off limits in an almost constitutional sense. I don't know if Peter wants to add to that.
Yeah. Just because you brought up data governance, which I think is a very important issue and a piece of the DFI. And I think of it kind of as follows. So DFI lays out a very kind of high standard vision that is largely a vision that's going to be shared by folks who believe in a set of democratic norms, of human rights norms, and of kind of economic principles. And it's also a comprehensive vision, right? It's about freedom online, it's about a competitive internet economy, it's about use of trusted network infrastructure, it's about pushing back on cyber attacks, as Tim says. But this DFI is certainly not the only way or the only approach in which we're going to try to write rules of the road on pieces of what you might call the internet ecosystem. And if I think about data governance per se, sort of a subset here, we certainly see the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and I think Catherine Tai, Ambassador USTR Tai, talked about this some in her remarks out in Los Angeles last week. We see the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework as a way of building out a set of rules on data governance and on the internet economy that brings in some partners who frankly are not part of the DFI, because they may share interests with us in some areas but not in other areas here. So I think of the DFI as laying out that overarching vision, but in no way precludes us driving pieces of the agenda through other platforms that bring in other partners as well. And I think you'll see that, as I say, with IPEF as that goes forward.
I might want to pick up on that IPEF point and how it ties into the DFI as well. And I don't know, Nick, maybe if you'd like to add to that, but I wanted to ask you, talking about all the different pieces in the DFI, how does business tie into this? And can an open internet really be a secure internet? How does industry see this?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, just thank you so much to the Asia Society for hosting this event today, and to Peter's great opening remarks. I think this is a really important discussion to be having right now at this moment. We have the DFI in place. We have new visions being articulated by democracies and by some authoritarian countries as to where the internet goes forward from here. And I think you can see in this debate that's happening, including in the recent Council for Foreign Relations report on confronting reality in cyberspace, some very different perspectives on how to sort of litigate this debate and how to drive a stronger response to these global trends that we're all concerned about. And I think there are three main questions that have emerged from this debate. The first, I think, is what's the right geopolitical strategy? What's the right sort of concatenation of allies and other partners to actually take on these challenges and to counter authoritarian misuse and control of technology? The second is how can we work beyond just our allies to find some of those middle ground countries that are leaning in either direction right now and bring them on board for a vision of really addressing some of the harms and risks that we've seen from the internet over the last 20 years and really taking a serious effort to mitigate a lot of the externalities we've seen from the internet, especially in developing countries. And third, how can we work with our allies to avoid sort of own goals on technology sovereignty issues? And how do we avoid setting up a template among democracies that then gets abused by authoritarian rivals as they implement their own vision of the internet? So I think the responses to these questions really depend on your perspective in some ways. If you're coming at this from a pure security perspective, sometimes you see there's an allure to just creating a coalition of the willing and really enforcing that boundary between allied countries and not allied countries. But I think if you care about global networking protocols and standards to keep the internet running, you really need to have a bigger tent than just those that concatenation of allies. Thanks. But I do think there is a really important sort of technical and economic and human rights dimension to all of these arguments that isn't always sort of at the fore of the debate. So I hope that today's discussion really lets us go a bit deeper on that. I would say just on the security point, I do think it's really important to frame up the alignment of openness and security. There are so many ways in which open collaboration and open debate about where we're going from here needs to have a broader participation than just the sort of the traditional democratic allies that we think of to have that debate. There are real threats from ransomware and from cyber attacks happening around the world. There's exploitation of legacy technology stacks we've seen through Hafnium and SolarWinds. There's just a real need to build up an open dialogue to address these challenges together rather than separately. And I think we can talk a lot more about why openness results in better security outcomes down the road, but I'll leave it there for now.
Great, that's a great overview. Speaking of harms, it's one thing to have a vision and a framework, but it's quite another thing to bring it down to the ground and to figure out how these principles in the DFI affect real people on the ground. And before we started here, we were talking in another room, and I was remarking to Farzana that this is my first time actually meeting her in person. We're actually connected online, funnily enough, through a different community. And Farzana has been very, very active as part of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network. I see her emails flying every single day, several times a day. And Farzana, I wanted to ask you about what this means for civil society, having an open, secure, and interoperable internet. Because in many countries around the world, there is this constant, delicate balancing act of preserving the internet for free speech, communication, connectivity. But on the other hand, you see a very real risk of particularly diverse societies imploding because of this free flow of information, misinformation, and disinformation. How do you strike that balance, particularly for minority communities, right, in multicultural societies? How do you preserve that protection for communities that are at risk of hate speech or speech that propagates violence? And we see this in different parts of the world even today. How do you strike that balance in an open internet?
Thank you. So I wish that we were trying to come up with that fine balance between open and secure internet and also remediate harm. Unfortunately, the states are very reactionary when it comes to online harm and disinformation, and their tools are very limited to just takedowns and removals and punitive measures, as we call it. And but let's go back and think about the internet as the positive force that it was. We, as people, globally used it as a positive force that connected us, and for a while it was indiscriminatory connection. So it wasn't based on your nationality. I am from Iran, and I remember when we started using the internet from Iran, it was a whole new world that opened door to us. And we could one-on-one discuss things with civil society in the US or in any other places. And we should not forget how we use the internet. And I don't want to say that the internet was people used the internet. People made the internet as it is now. When we talk about this kind of like openness and internet freedom is an American value, this is not an American value. Of course, the US in the beginning was an advocate, but if the technical operators, if the network operators around the world didn't want to connect with each other, regardless of their nationality and all the political conflicts, then we would not have had internet. So we should look at it in that light. And the other, so for the how we can come up with that balance and initiatives like DFI, how they can help, I think that we need to be more solution-oriented and give more than lip service to the civil society participation and have a role for civil society. And nation states should make sure of that. Because, yes, true, so you want to work with your trusted democratic states to preserve the open, global, interoperable internet. But also these are the values that are shared by vulnerable communities that live in states that do not, that have contradictory values, that want to impose them on those communities. So being solution-oriented, I mean, I wish I could, I really wanted to see that when sanctions happened against Russia, and the unintended consequences of that for the internet, I really wanted to see that initiatives like DFI were invoked so that collectively states would say, okay, so no, we should not sanction access to infrastructure. Mm-hmm. It should not hamper that. So I want to see something like that to happen. For Afghanistan as well, we are going to see their access to the internet be diminished, their online presence be diminished. So I think that these are the factors that we need to consider, and especially for civil society in order, at Christchurch Call, for example, or other multi-stakeholder initiatives that want to eradicate hate online or terrorist activities online. We should also have the government to collaborate with the governments in a more meaningful fashion, so that these impacted communities' voices is also heard, and also we do not come up with rules and laws that are against that open, interoperable notion of the internet. It's a great thing to eliminate and eradicate. It's also wishful thinking in a way of like online radicalization and terrorism, but we need to come up with ways to do that without hampering access.
Can I just offer one comment on that? I think it's a good question and a challenging one, and one I think needs to be met with nuance. A scholar named Jonathan Zittrain wrote more than 10 years ago a book called The Future of the Internet and How to Avoid It. And he warned in that book, it was a very prescient book, that the sort of real threat to the internet as we then knew it was an overreaction to security threat. So that was his basic point. And I think we face the following dilemma. We in the U.S. government, up from the president on down, very concerned about rise in hate speech, violent extremism. We're having an event this coming Thursday, United We Stand Against Hate, to show that Americans are in fact united against hate and hate speech and violent extremism. On the other hand, it's very important, I think we recognize this and feel this very acutely, that we not let the overreaction become an excuse for a lockdown of our societies, that we continue to adhere to the values that have always been fundamental. And I think that's what the DFI is trying to do. When I said it's sort of almost constitutional, and some is trying to set the basic rules for what thou shall not should be for countries in the internet. This is some of the sense we're talking about. Precisely for the reasons you just described, that it's very sort of easy to become, to use sort of speech that people are concerned about as an excuse to go much further in lockdowns than really should be done.
And Nabiha, you might have thoughts on this too, but I wanted to ask you, speaking of harms and Peter, in your introductory remarks, you mentioned surveillance. Nabi, I'd like to ask you about, again, this balancing act. So on the one hand, information that's readily available on the internet is hugely empowering. It provides knowledge and connectivity to millions of people. On the other hand, that information is sometimes, some people would argue oftentimes, obtained at the cost of privacy. We click agree to everything, not really reading the terms of service, and also at the cost of commodification of that information and data. And given varying treatments of data in different parts of the world, how do we preserve personal privacy? How do we protect personal data so that the internet remains this trusted, empowering ecosystem? But also, how do we still ensure that that information flows very freely without intruding into or violating those precepts of privacy and data protection?
It's a gloriously big question. I want to join the sort of chorus of people saying thank you for having us today. I have to say, in reading the DFI, I was so thrilled to see both privacy and freedom of expression mentioned, because so often they're put at loggerheads, but in fact they are necessary components. Without privacy, you can't really have the sufficient reassurances you need to have dissenting views, to experiment with dissenting views, and it's wonderful to have those in the same place, but as you point out, there are real moments where the rubber hits the road. Now, we know that privacy is valued by a variety of countries. 137 countries have versions of data protection, data privacy legislation. And privacy is also a really convenient cover for other digital sovereignty type of initiatives that really are just giving states some sort of pretext to exercise control over domestic data, right? Really giving them access to, or the ability to say, well, for privacy reasons, we'd like to keep this data in the country. We'd like to access this data. By the way, this is very convenient if we think we have domestic national security concerns or a host of other explanations. And so you see the tension right away, right, in proffering privacy as a value and what it can open up. So I think in the DFI, there were sort of three ingredients I was really heartened by, strings to pull on, accepting, as Peter says, that of course the declaration is not meant to be comprehensive, it's a start of values. The first is when we look at sort of these privacy protective initiatives in a variety of different countries, evaluate those proposals to make sure that they're actually solving for principles of privacy and data protection and not just increased governmental control, right? There's a fantastic report by Freedom House from 2020 that says user privacy or cyber sovereignty and actually lays out a number of questions you can ask to interrogate is this law pretextual or is it actually getting to the privacy needs that we have? And they look at things like the broad scope of the data localization requirement, whether human rights impact assessments were done, whether there was actually a multi-stakeholder process, whether a free and fair elections, elected officials participate in a political process that can evaluate this sort of legislation. There's a whole host of questions we can be asking to make sure, just at step one, is this new approach to balancing privacy and free expression actually legit or just something else, right? The second is really understanding the role of technology. I would argue that some of the biggest advances in protecting privacy, like end-to-end encryption, really are based in technological innovation, not just governmental rules in different places. And so making sure that we're nourishing, encouraging, partnering with industry, and new entrants into industry and innovation on these technological solutions, I think is an important component too. And the third is reiterating sort of the importance of multi-stakeholder approaches. And I would say it's traditional civil society, like Farzana and all the work that you do. But I want to make a special shout out for the types of independent researchers and reporters that I work with at the Markup. So the Markup, which I run, is a nonprofit news organization that builds technologies that equip others to hold technologies to account. So we'll do things like audits of Facebook, audits of other platforms to understand what is the delta between, what is said and what is actually happening, what populations and communities are being harmed. Creating an infrastructure for independent researchers to be able to assess how technology is working and whether governmental intervention in them is, how that's shaping the dynamic is necessary. We've seen in the EU, right, in sort of the Brussels approach, room for creating agreed upon standards for how independent researchers can be doing this kind of evaluative accountability work, right? It can't just be that, the government says, trust us, we'll call Google and we'll see how it's working, because leaving it between those two stakeholders doesn't have the independence that we really need. And I would encourage us, as we think about the role of civil society, to really make room for that kind of academic research, for independent journalists and other people to really be checking in this sort of multipolar environment. That's the only way we're going to get through this tension.
Can I just chime in quickly? I think that's actually a really core point, which is that regulation and governance just by a governmental official often isn't enough to account for the externalities and harms that we're seeing online. And I think that's, I don't always agree with the Markup and everything they do, but but I think it's actually a really powerful voice to have out there to be able to hold tech companies accountable. And I think, compared to many other groups, Markup is very rigorous and fact-based in their approach. And I do think that is a key part of regulation ultimately, is having that kind of independent check on what a government and a tech company is doing, to have some broader system of accountability out there. And I do think the EU has made some important moves in this direction too, through researcher data access provisions.
Great. Consensus. We're beginning to talk a little bit about kind of how you actually operationalize some of these DFI principles. Peter or Tim, do you have anything else to add about how the DFI principles, rather than just kind of being motherhood statements, how they can be concretely operationalized, especially in different parts of the world with very different regimes in data governance and privacy and basically in different approaches to an open internet?
Tim, do you want to start?
Oh, you want me to go ahead? Okay. I was going to put that one to you, but that's all right. No, I think that's, it's an important question. Again, I think we are always, I think the question is always raised if there's any, declaration and even international treaty, what are people going to do to make sure it's enforced, or that the people live up to their expectations? One of the things I want to say is that we are working with partners who have already endorsed this declaration and are taking it further. We're holding a multi-stakeholder conference later this year. And I think one of the goals of that conference will be to outline the ways in which we can make sure that countries continue to work on their on making sure they uphold the commitments in the DFI. I also want to raise a matter which is a little more abstract, which is to say, while the DFI isn't, by its nature a binding treaty or something along those lines, it is evident that who is signed up to the DFI and who isn't. And it is possible for countries to forfeit certain economic opportunities that may come with being a member of the DFI, whether by private investors or otherwise. So we think that the sort of goal, like any sort of project, is the sending of signals by countries as to where they stand and what kind of principles they're going to stand up for. And we hope that that will be in its own way self-enforcing.
I want to give actually a very specific example, because I think what you're going to see over the coming months and years is really a number of different ways of operationalizing these principles. And I want to give one very specific example just recently. It's responsive actually, Farzana, to a point you made about the internet in Russia. And it's been interesting, as we, from an American perspective, going back maybe 8 or 10 years now, have generally tried to carve out certain aspects, major aspects of sort of telecoms and internet connectivity with sanctioned jurisdictions. So in Iran, for example, back in, I want to say 2012 or 2013, issued a set of licenses to allow U.S. tech firms to kind of interconnect with Iran. And that has become, although not quite a sort of a standard thing across our sanctions regimes, it has become pretty common. And earlier this year, we made sort of a strategic decision as the U.S. government, as we were ramping up sanctions on Russia, that we were going to try to carve out food and medicine and telecom and internet connectivity from our Russia sanctions. That has not always been true with other countries. And so actually, just a very specific example, in late spring, early summer, we started hearing from some telecoms companies in Europe that because of aspects of European sanctions on Russia, they weren't going to be able to pay for interconnectivity with Russian telecom networks anymore. Because the sanctions prohibited payments with these sanctioned Russian companies, and obviously if they can't pay, they'll get disconnected. And I, sort of my colleagues, began to proactively engage with both the UK and with Brussels to sort of say, look, we have a core shared vision that is global of internet connectivity, and you need to provide some greater authorizations here, or else, we are going to see Russia getting disconnected, not just because of all the things they're doing, but sort of inadvertently by some of the things we are doing. And we have gotten, I think there's a little bit more to be done, but we've begun to get some licenses, particularly out of the UK, to clear that up. And I think that really is coming out of the DFI, because we were able to go back and reflect, look, we've all made this commitment to an open and connectivity, and that is incumbent on like what we are doing, not just about what other countries are doing. So I actually think that you're going to see, in addition to things like IPEF and civil society conferences and whatnot, just sort of a series of ways in which we can operationalize these principles as we've gotten alignment behind them as we've rolled this out.
Can I?
Of course.
So that's really excellent. We're hoping that we can see like collective action like this in the future as well, so that we don't have to go to each jurisdiction and get a license. But also for the, you were mentioning like human rights impact assessment, but also I think that in the legislative efforts that the states do, and they should also have impact assessments of interoperability and openness of the internet, if we can advocate for that. And that comes where we need balancing between the legislations that want to prevent and fight with online harm, and also open and interoperable internet.
I want to pick up on the IPEF point, Peter, because it's very current. Is the DFI going to tie into IPEF, and particularly under the trade pillar, digital trade? Some people have mentioned that they might want to not be a part of that just yet. How does the DFI tie into IPEF, if at all?
Yeah, so look, I think that, first of all, I think we're very pleased with the outcomes out in Los Angeles last week, where I think we really got very strong support from across the IPEF community for all 4 pillars of the IPEF. And it was interesting, I think, and sort of very pleased to see like the level of engagement and commitment we've got out of even a couple of countries that frankly on some of these issues can be challenging, like Indonesia, right? But actually expressing a lot of support and full participation across. So very, very pleased with the outcomes we saw in LA. Obviously quite a bit of work to do. That was the start, not the end of a negotiation, but really appreciate the start. I think that, sort of coming back to some of the remarks I made earlier, we see the DFI as laying out a vision, and there is on the kind of data governance and data security space, there is a set of high-level principles we have articulated here, right, around privacy, around using trusted network information infrastructure, around the free flow of data as well. So, but these are high-level principles in the DFI. They're not sort of operational trade commitments, right? I think what we can do with the IPAF is draw on some of these high-level principles and kind of translate them into operational commitments in a way that brings them down from 30,000 feet to 5,000 feet and really makes them operational, while also simultaneously bringing in some partners that are not DFI members because they may not be quite ready yet on some aspects of the DFI, but might be ready or hopefully ready on some of the data-specific aspects of the DFI.
Yeah.
And just staying on that point, Nick, I'm sure you're very well aware that there are concerns in some particularly larger markets in Asia, but also in other parts of the global south and the world, that having this open ecosystem, what's called fair and competitive by some, is sometimes viewed as a little unfair in other places. And that this system effectively privileges large foreign multinational corporations that have this inherent competitive advantage in size, structure, and reach. And these concerns particularly relate to cross-border data flows, right? So how does keeping the internet open and global and interoperable help level the playing field for micro, small, and medium enterprises in many of these local economies? And MSMEs form the backbone of many of these economies.
Yeah, that's a really important point to draw out, which is that, and I think it's the theme of our discussion today, really, which is you really need to think about the impact of these measures, not just on large tech companies, but also on small businesses and everyday internet users out there who really want access to the rest of the world and don't want to be off in a closed system somewhere. Taking a step back, I do think we've had sort of a series of seemingly once-in-a-generation crises over the last couple of years around the world. Obviously, a global health crisis that we're still part of right now. Russia's war in Ukraine, I think, and sort of the redounding effects of that on other geopolitical issues and sort of dramatic strains on fiscal resources. All of this does create a temptation, I think, for governments to sort of turn inward a bit right now and to say, look, we're going to, move away from some of those commitments around connectivity to the rest of the world and create more of a closed architecture that maybe can help our indigenous companies grow a bit more effectively without competition from global rivals, or otherwise sort of provide some kind of thumb on the scale to help those local companies grow. And I think that's an understandable temptation at this point. But I do think like the experience of everyday small businesses and users of the internet sort of belies the wisdom of that point. There's an economic point here, which is I think that if you're a small business or a small enterprise trying to grow in a developing country, you really do depend upon access to digital tools to become an exporter, to grow your business, to gain sort of sales around the world. And if you're an internet user, you really also want to be able to communicate across borders with your family, your loved ones, and colleagues, and that sort of thing. And I do think there is sort of this need to connect the economic point there. There's a separate economic point too, which is if you're a startup in one of those countries trying to grow up and you're faced with a web of sort of confusing local versus global regulations, that can make it harder for you to outcompete some of the larger tech firms in your market. But I do think tying that back to the human rights point too, and pointing out really that some of the initiatives that have been designed for economic issues to create a sort of a vision of economic sovereignty over the internet do have implications for human rights and broader internet values, because oftentimes the infrastructure that's used to separate a country off from the rest of the internet, whether it's sort of data localization or various kinds of ISP blocking or messing with the domain name system in some way, those measures often are then used and sometimes abused by governments to get access to people's data, to limit the ability of people to engage in free expression online. So I do think drawing out the connectivity between the economic arguments and the human rights and broader values arguments is really important. And this is where I think the Declaration for the Future of the Internet is so important, because it does draw that linkage very clearly and shows that we do have a lot to gain, not just as a set of democracies, but as an entire world to have connectivity and to have access to the internet go across borders. There's a lot. Again, there are harms to address in doing that kind of work, and there's a real need for a smarter regulatory approach on a lot of different issues right now, including privacy and security and many others. But I think you can do that at the same time as you sort of upgrade those global norms, and that's where the DFI framework, I think, is a really valuable initiative.
Can I jump in here a little bit? I just want to remind ourselves of just how high how high the stakes are here. So much stuff is moving on to the internet that when we're talking about the discussion of the future of the internet, it's also the future of almost everything. And reflecting this conversation about privacy, there's a very important question as to what is bona fide and justified regulation within sovereign control, and what is an excuse for government power and government overreaching. And I think the DFI is trying to draw that line by setting out this code and saying, these are the things not to do. We have supported, in fact, last week we put out some of our tech principles, and we believe that countries have the right to regulate their economies and ensure fair competition and so forth. But the line is when it becomes, like with privacy, an excuse for something where the stakes are very high, which is a major move towards governments surveilling their own citizens. Invasions of privacy goes with this. Controlling the political system, internet shutdowns, and that's really what we have to keep in mind here.
I have a bunch of other questions, but I do recognize there are some experts in the room as well as watching online. So I'm going to ask one more question of both Farzaneh and Nabiha, and then I'll open it up. And so we will also be taking, just to reiterate, we'll also be taking questions and comments from our social media accounts. So those of you tuning in, don't feel left out. But speaking of human rights, I'm glad you brought up that point, Nick. Farzaneh, how do we make the internet and digital policies more broadly more inclusive for particularly underrepresented and marginalized communities?
Well, that's an easy question. So, as I said, we need to give the civil society and impacted communities more than like a lip service, that they are very important, more than a conference, and they should have like structures that they can get involved with, and they also see the results of their participation. And I think that's way we can, but that's just one part of it. And of course, we should have human rights impact assessment, and see if the measures that we have taken, if the policies that we have, what sort of effect they have on human rights, and a kind of like correct course. Because otherwise, then we just have this, I call it the multi-stakeholder theater, that everybody is free to come and just say whatever, and then we go home and the decision makers just make decisions. So I think having those structures in place and having an impact assessment in place is very important to operation.
And presumably you mean participation from the very beginning, right? Not halfway through the
Not
process.
Not tag along, as you know. Okay. Yeah, and also learning from the experiences of others, like New Zealand and France. They have a lot of experience of what they shouldn't have done, and what in the beginning of the convening the Christchurch call. And now I'm very glad to see there has been improvement, and I'm very interested to know that what the U.S. especially has like what sort of agenda they have for like their participation in Christchurch call and Freedom Online Coalition, but that's just too many questions. You can ask them later. Thank you.
I think that's a good point. Outlining not only what we should aspire to, but also learning from mistakes, right? Nabiha, you mentioned the importance of having a platform for independent researchers and also for investigative journalists and the media in general. What are the risks of a fragmented internet for people like that?
So many. I would say, first I would look at the fragmentation and say there's sort of a couple of different flavors of fragmentation. You see fragmentation in data, right? And that's the data localization point and what that leads to. Fragmentation in laws and norms that become increasingly untethered from freedom of expression principles, and that has a set of harms. And then you have fragmentation in access, right? Who can see what on the internet, right? And a different set of harms that flow from that. So taking them in order. The fragmentation in data, right? The idea that through these data localization and control-oriented approaches, what you see in the journalists I've worked with throughout my career and their sources is there's a huge chilling effect, right? Of who is willing to share what on what media and how people speak to one another. And we've seen in the last few years increased crackdowns on non-violent social media posts being prosecuted by a variety of governments. And so the chilling effect isn't just oh no, they have my data, something might happen. We're actually seeing those prosecutions, we're actually seeing physical harm. So the idea of fragmentation in data and having countries say, we have full access to this because of a legal infrastructure we put into place has real downstream implications for journalists and those researchers. Fragmentations of law and norms, as a defamation lawyer, this is not new, but it has sort of new frontiers in recent years. Having laws that are not tethered to these global principles of freedom of expression or what principles of the DFI is clarifying and underscoring, which is so important, means that you have, again, a lot of pretextual reasons to go after people. In the last few years, we've seen this proliferation of fake news-oriented legislation that's used to go after all kinds of journalists, right? So we see a prosecution right now in Kazakhstan of Elnur Ilyashev, who was just criticizing the ruling party in Kazakhstan, and he's being prosecuted under laws that were rolled out for the COVID-19 emergency and not spreading misinformation, right? So you see the same sort of pretextual balance that's happening because these laws are proliferating in this moment, as Nick said, of countries sort of turning inward and saying, well, I don't know about those shared principles. We have our own problems going on. And the last of sort of fragmentation of access, right? I think about like the lack of access to the internet in Kashmir and a variety of other places. It is truly the most stark example of what happens when you have unchecked censorship. You literally do not know what is happening in your own society. There is no way to hold power to account. There's no accountability structures that can flourish. And the more you remove sort of global platforms like the Googles of the world, the YouTubes, the other places that can act as a check, the more vulnerable those populations can be. And frankly, those platforms are in a challenging position too, as the sort of fragmentation of legal norms ascends. What I find fascinating about all of the fragmentation, and again, building on Nick's point, is it's from this sort of defensive crouch posture of we have to keep bad things out. We have to keep bad information out. I do not often see active proposals to say, how do we enhance truthful, valuable information from the ground up? How are we supporting civil society? How are we funding independent media? How are we making sure that we're nourishing the information ecosystem and not just retreating from it? And I think that's a really valuable frontier that I would encourage different countries to explore. How do you nourish the ecosystem, not just, which is, of course, for me, one of the great promises of what the internet was meant to be, right? It was meant to nourish and encourage that ecosystem. I think we can do that with more resources too.
It's always easier to say no than it is to propose
Always.
other approaches, right? So I'd like to open the floor to all of you in the audience here in the room. There is a mic that is in the center of the room. I would encourage you to identify who you are very briefly And if you have a specific question or other kinds of intervention posed to a particular panelist, please do say so. The floor is now open.
Hello, everyone. I'm a student at Columbia Law School. Thank you so much for coming here. This is an awesome discussion. So I guess one of the areas that I'm really interested in is market concentration. And I know, Tim, that this is an area that you work in very actively right now. But my question is really to Google, which is there's been a lot of discussion about interoperability in the superstructure of the internet. But if the companies that operate in it, as a consumer, if our window into the internet isn't so interoperable, and increasingly the big tech platforms aren't so interoperable, what does interoperability even mean?
Sure. No, I think interoperability is a key value, not just for the internet itself and protocols and standards, but also within companies. So there's a lot of value in trying to get data out of some of the walled gardens that are out there, and whether that's Google or Apple or Facebook, any other big companies, I do think that we do need a stronger approach to figuring out how to ensure that people can move their data and move their services out of those platforms into newer rivals. In the cloud space in particular, I think that's a really critical point, because there really is a very different set of architectures between different cloud companies sometimes, and really having a clear set of standards that allow people to ensure that there is service portability. That's less of a consumer issue, more of a business issue, but I do think advancing those kinds of sort of open cloud principles and open internet principles more broadly, tying into interoperability, is a really important endeavor. It's hard to, there are certainly challenges that we face around ensuring that as data gets shared, that encryption can still apply in various contexts. But I do think it's a really important point and something we need to think more closely about as a company, as governments.
Greetings.
Hey, Tim.
We meet again.
It's
I mean
been
it
a while.
positively. It's been a while.
Tim, did you happen to notice that the Republican on the FCC just came out in favor of net neutrality very strongly in Korea, where they're looking to charge some American companies like Google a fee to, it was really odd to see the net neutrality coming from a conservative Republican who has no idea what net neutrality means. But that was good. I have a question that's not rhetorical, but let me put a few data points on here. The first is Nicholas is the only one who directly brought up the elephant in the room. Somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the internet are not among the countries here. Obviously, most of them are populations of color, and obviously, when we talk about the other countries being involved, being the Europeans with the United States, we all know what that is. Other data points. I was glad to hear that you rejected the U.S. position at the Wicket, where I was. This was the big ITU meeting 10 years ago, where the United States walked out of the big international meeting, essentially of an issue that amounted to whether people in Iran could pay for subscriptions to the New York Times. It was the most extreme splintering of the internet that I've ever seen, when we just walked out, even though 2/3 of the nations there, which represented 2/3 of the world population, definitely wanted to move ahead. So I'm glad you changed the U.S. opinion on that, and that the ITU may have a role. The other observation is that I've been involved actively in the Internet Society, IETF, and so on. And when we talk about civil society, we're again ignoring an elephant. The people we call civil society are also overwhelmingly it's hard getting old. I can speak to that. Are overwhelmingly white males who agree with the United States position up and down the line on almost everything. They may support encryption, for example, and the U.S. is unclear. And it was even more interesting, and I was really glad to hear the support you have from the White House Because in effect, what we're saying here when we talk about privacy is that the most effective surveillance operation in the world, which I'm pretty sure is the NSA watching 3 or 4 billion people on the internet, which the people who are not represented in this world, in this room, are very aware of. And you're saying that we shouldn't be doing that, which is, but that's all rhetoric. And I frankly think that, so I have a question, a quick one that's direct.
Please.
Yeah, okay. The question that I'm aiming at the folks in the White House is, what happens to our current policy of technological containment of China, which is what we're talking about when you keep saying trusted, when the Chinese develop EUV lithography, which is the only big obstacle to them producing world-class chips, which I suspect is going to happen in 3 to 5 years, and how do we sustain our policy of holding back Chinese technology when we no longer have a monopoly on anything important?
Thank you.
Well, you've covered a broad variety of topics, and I'm always, we've known each other a long time, and I've gained a lot over the years from what you're talking about. It's true, it's been a while. I remember with great fondness the net neutrality wars. So I think that there's no question from the White House's perspective that we face, you mentioned China and elephants in the room, that we face challenge. I'm not going to comment on any sort of specific particular issue, but I think that part of what we've been saying up here is that it is a time for the United States, other countries, to demonstrate leadership and make it clear, what we stand for. And that part of the DFI is enumeration of principles, and I go back to this, a code was constitutional of what we think nation states should not be doing and things they should be doing. And I just want to reiterate something I said earlier, which is the stakes are extremely high. We're really talking about the future, without exaggeration, of humanity, of how people live, of how they communicate, of what they see and don't see. And that's why we're giving this the kind of level of focus and attention that we have. We take this very seriously. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Just take it out.
I didn't mean to cut you short. I just wanted to get up here, get my turn. Thank you all so much for being here. And my name is Jackie Freeberg. I'm a retired healthcare professional. And I am so skeptical of everything I see and read on the internet. Forget television and the media in general. But so how are you going to find out what's real, what isn't, and how will the public get this information? And what sanctions will you pose? Say you find this site, this whatever, is not doing the right thing. How will you deal with it?
Is your question directed to any particular?
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Is your question directed to any particular speaker, Ms. Freeberg?
No, not to anybody that could answer it.
I'm happy to jump in again if you want. I think you've put your finger on one of the great challenges in our age for democracy, which is, democracy relies on sort of an educated population. It's very important that there's a dissemination of facts that people can make their opinions based on. And I do think we live in an age of profound mistrust as to various gatekeepers, various sources that were considered reliable, and also, as Peter said in his opening remarks, often deliberate use of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda techniques. So these, I think, need to be taken very seriously. Among the other things the White House is involved in is the promotion of democracy, and I think that begins at home. It's an area in which we face great challenges. At the same time, and this has always been an American tradition, we have enormous respect for free expression. The First Amendment of the Constitution greatly limits what government. We don't want to be in a society where the government is saying this is true and this is not true. So the challenge, and I think for all democracies, particularly the United States, is to strike this balance where we return to this ideal of an informed citizenry with facts they can rely on, but without going so far as to be a country that becomes censorial and violates their own values. It's a balance we've struck well at times, and we're in a period of great challenge, and I think your own experience speaks to that.
If I could hop in, I would say to offer a point of optimism, we are in a moment of great mistrust. We've also been here before, right? So if you think just 100 years ago, the rise of pamphlets, of yellow journalism in this city, right? Where you could be on any street corner and say like, did aliens land yesterday? This seems to say no, right? They looked the same. In the same way when you go on the internet, I mean, the number of WhatsApp messages that I have that tell me that turmeric will cure COVID and a variety of other things, because they're sort of the way they're being distributed. The New York Times looks just as credible as some random post by Yahoo number 5. What happened over the last 100 years is that we started to identify these institutional markers of, okay, that place is trusted, that's not, that's a methodology that works, that's a process that we accept. I like this reporter, I don't like that reporter. We saw that sort of emerge, and it's messy and it's slow. I would say we're in the darkest moment of that at the moment with the internet, that sort of aspect of how do we identify which institutions to trust and which ones we don't. I think we'll see over the next 10 years. I don't have a clear, here's the 5-point plan for it, but I do trust that it'll happen because we navigated it before. It's really spicy in the interim, but we'll get there.
Let's agree we trust the markup.
Yeah, wonderful. I'll take that. Should be your homepage.
Do you want to chime in on this? Or
Oh, no, it's okay.
Okay, all right.
I love this. It feels very American to walk up into the middle and do this. My name's Matt. I work at the Tony Blair Institute on Digital Rights and Social Media Regulation. I think what's quite interesting is hypocrisy is a narrative that's used to attack principles like this quite often. The US says something to do this kind of stuff, but then for the rest of the world it seems a bit, that's right, it seems a bit proselytizing, and you hold a certain set of values to account for liberal democracies, but for every journalist that's being imprisoned, you have Assange being extradited. For every fake news law that comes in, there's this whole Section 230 debate. And so what is the pragmatic way? You said the DFI principles are just as much for the whole world as it is to hold liberal democracies to account. How do we start dismantling that hubris and having those hard conversations domestically about is the Cloud Act okay? Do we need to reform the myriad of things that make the technology regulation space really problematic? And so what's the path forward there on the introspective side domestically?
Matt, I saw you looking at Peter, but then I also saw you looking at other panelists. So is there a particular speaker?
I'm very keen for the White House view, but I'm also very keen to get, big tech is also very hypocritical. It's been for a very long time. So it'd be great to get opinions there as well.
Well, I'll offer maybe just some brief remarks and then open it up for others, because I think you raise a very fair point. And I think certainly from a Biden and Harris administration perspective, we very much believe, as Tim suggested, we need to focus on improving our democracy here at home first, right? And you've seen that be a consistent theme of this administration. I think you saw us when the president hosted his democracy summit, International Democracy Summit last December, but certainly heard plenty from stakeholders about what we need to be doing better here. And I think we are, as we deal with the myriad policy issues in front of us right now, looking for ways that as we implement those policy issues, we can better live up to the principles that we've articulated here. And I'll give one example. You bring up surveillance and what the U.S. intelligence agencies do. One of the things I have had on my plate since really going back to January of last year when I came in is I've been sort of at my level the lead negotiator with the European Commission on the successor to the Privacy Shield agreement. And we obviously announced a deal in principle back in April. Maybe it was late March when the president was over in Europe. And that was a lengthy and hard-fought negotiation with the Europeans about what, even in principle, are we prepared to do from their perspective to make sure that U.S. intelligence surveillance practices accord with law and that there's an appropriate redress mechanism for European citizens who think they're not, much as U.S. citizens have judicial courts here in the U.S. that they can go to. You know, I've gotten asked by various folks over the last couple of months, because it's been now 6 months or so since we had this deal in principle, about what is it that's taking us so long to roll out or implementing regs. And some of that is just, you know, things are complicated in government, but a lot of it is, you know, we made a set of commitments as a part of this negotiation, which hopefully in the near term we will be concluded and roll out publicly, that are changing, you know, the activities of our intelligence agencies. And we committed to do that to the Europeans as a part of this, and kind of actually corralling that and getting all of our agencies in line is not an easy process, because you got to think through lots of different operational modalities and lots of different regions and things that they're doing. And so I think, you know, what you'll see when we come forward, hopefully in the near term, with implementing the implementing regs on that is really something that looks quite different. That's really going to be quite meaningful. And then the Europeans, of course, are going to give us an adequacy agreement so that folks like Google can continue to transmit data across the Atlantic. But I think that this is an example of how, you know, we are working very hard, including with respect to what we ourselves do and some of the hardest conversations you can have to try to better live up to these principles.
Yeah, I'll say one word on that. I think you raised something that's a real challenge for Western diplomacy in our times, and you know, and the tricky, and I think it is incumbent upon us not to adopt an attitude that we have all the answers. You know, we've figured it all out, and you know, listen to us, and there you go. And it's also important to acknowledge, the United States has a very long history, has made its mistakes. I also, you know, and I've been outside of government critical of the United States in certain respects. I think it's also dangerous and important not to accept a false equivalence, however, and accept whataboutism as something that blunts any of our efforts. You know, I'm coming to people in this audience or the room to be like, well, well, you're saying these are important. Haven't you done this once or something? So that the whole message gets buried and lost. That itself is a propaganda technique that people need to be, keep in mind. And it goes back to something that I think is important. And I keep saying this, but the goal of the DFI is less to try to go around the gray areas where, you know, maybe your intellectual property laws are too much. Or this. Some of these are things that no nation state should be doing. You know, spying on and arresting dissidents, shutting off the internet during an election. You know, unlawful surveillance, arrests. You know, basically state power exercised through the internet in extremely aggressive ways. And we can't. And I urge everyone in this room and listening not to allow like whataboutism and, you know, false equivalence to blunt that message that there is a difference between the gray area issues and the issues that no nation state and the things that no nation state should be doing.
Sure. I mean, I want to echo Tim's earlier point that the analogy to the Constitution, I think, is a good one here, because it is sort of about binding yourself to the mast with respect to certain norms and aspirations that, you know, of course, none of us can fully live up to at all times, but to open us up to critique on that basis, too, and to say, whether you're a government or a company or anybody else, that there are certain values and principles that you hold dear, and you want third parties and governments and others around the world to hold you against those principles, especially in situations where you might feel inclined to compromise against those for certain other reasons. So I do think whether it's a government or a company or a civil society group that has sort of endorsed these kinds of Declaration for the Future of the Internet principles, recognizing that it is a step to hold yourself up to them, and I think we and others welcome critiques on areas where we're not fully living up to some of the norms being articulated in this framework.
I just wanted to add one sentence. So I totally agree with you, and I think that in the efforts of democratic countries when they want to overcome online harms or come up with legislation, they should not use the tools that authoritarian regimes use in order to do those things. And I say that because it kind of legitimizes those tools. And yes, you can say that we have a very great democratic process, and but in the end, they are not immune to mistakes. And we have seen this over and over, and especially online, it gets trickier.
Yeah.
Thanks. We'll have a second crack at the microphone. Thanks. So I come at this not as a tech expert in any way, but as a recovering diplomat. Nick made the point that one of the challenges is broadening the tent. And when I look at the DFI, one thing that strikes me, not on the substance, is the fact that there are some real conspicuous absences, some names missing from the list of signatories that are major democracies, as well as small states that are particularly not only vulnerable, but stand to gain the most from the commercial benefits from open internet and so on. So for anybody on the panel, I'm curious about how you would make the strong business case to, or case to the fence sitters for why this is not a moment to just be a spectator, why it actually matters to sign on the dotted line of the DFI.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you raised that. One thing I'll say maybe to the whole audience, and we did just open the DFI for signatures, and so it's not a closed document, and we're if anyone's in the audience wanting to join, representing the country, we're accepting. And I say this seriously, that we're people who this wasn't public at first. It was announced only relatively recently, and so maybe some countries need some time to understand what's going on. But I think it is incumbent upon us to make the case. As I said earlier in this talk, in this panel, it does send a signal. Everyone knows who is and who isn't in the DFI, and I think there is an important business case to be made. I think it is in many ways very similar to the classic case for trade in general, that being connected with the rest of the world is a route to economic prosperity. Now, I want to, so I think that is incumbent upon us to make. I think that it's important that we also talk with civil society, talk with our business partners to make it clear how this message is. And above all, I think it's important, this comes back to your fragmentation point. We do not want a situation where the incentives point in the direction of just pulling out of the internet for your own benefits without there being any costs, if that makes sense. Countries and throughout history have and sometimes pulled out, isolated themselves from the world, and there's usually a great number of costs that come with that, and sometimes it happens. And some countries will always sort of, for whatever reasons, take those stances. But I think it is important. It is, over the last decade, almost become a situation where you could see reasons to want to partially fragment yourself out and try and take advantage of it. And I think it's incumbent upon us to change that calculus for countries. And we're in the early stages, but that's part of what we're trying to do.
Just to hop in, I think it actually builds really nicely on your framing earlier. If you look at the internet, not as it's the future of the internet over there, but the future of our existence. They build on a lot of the arguments against isolation that we've had for decades, right? And sort of contextualize it in that trajectory of, do you want to be part of the connected world, or do you want to be off in a corner somewhere else, losing out on all kinds of economic opportunities and ways to participate. So I think there's a resonance with a long-standing narrative there.
how do we operationalize this? So for parties interested in participating in the DFI, how would they express interest?
Leave that to our diplomat.
No, so I'd say, I mean, first reach out, and I could answer, Danny, your question in a slightly different way. And you have been a diplomat for many years. You say you're now a recovering diplomat. One of the things you know as a diplomat is that when you are trying to build a coalition, you both need a compelling vision, and you also need, frankly, often opportunities that drive decisions and get people to sign up, right? And so that is why, as Tim alluded to, there's going to be a conference later this fall that will be a DFI conference, and we are working hard to bring some additional members in and using that event to bring in additional members. We've also been working to build the coalition through a variety of other sort of mechanisms we have. I mean, it wasn't a coincidence. We very much appreciate it. We launched the DFI. It was sort of between presidential administrations in South Korea, and we're very pleased that when the president was in Seoul, South Korea, having had a new president in power in South Korea, was able to come in. And so we're looking for other opportunities to use travel and events and multilateral gatherings to continue to build out additional support and membership here.
Great. We are at noon, and so all that is left for me to do is to thank you all very much, each and every one of you sitting on here, Peter, Fazane, Nick, Nabiha, and Tim. Thank you also to those of you who are here in the room and to those who tune in live. We hope you'll continue to have this conversation. If anything, hopefully this provoked more thought and discussion amongst you. Thank you very much also to our supporters, Google, for this event. And please continue to talk about this in your own networks. Thank you.
That's good questions for everybody. I'd only looked at my own, so I had not heard, read everyone else's question.